Welcome to Kepler Conversations. I'm Dr. Scott Postma. Kepler is an online marketplace for classical Christian education. We employ the historic university model and leverage the best available technology so that we can empower families by liberating teachers to make a classical liberal arts education available, accessible, and affordable. Well, today I'm joined by Kepler teacher Jeremy Wagner. Jeremy was raised as a pastor's kid in a small town New England church community. His first experience of classical languages was when his father taught him Latin and Greek roots in his fifth grade homeschool. But it wasn't until after he had graduated from Gordon College in 2009 that he discovered the Christian classical renewal and began to dive into Latin in earnest. That initial interest grew into an obsession and eventually a calling. Today, Jeremy is a CiRCE certified master teacher with an additional certification in Latin. He is a husband, a father of five, and a classical educator with more than a decade of experience as a full-time classroom teacher. Well, welcome, Jeremy. So good to have you in our Kepler Conversations today.
Thank you. It's good to have this opportunity.
Well, one of the things that we love to talk about in our Kepler Conversations is you. We want to hear a little bit about you and get to know you a little bit outside the bio and outside of your passion for the classroom. So maybe you could talk a little bit about yourself. You know, what your hobbies. What do you like to do? Who is Jeremy Wagner?
Okay, so probably my biggest hobby is studying Latin, to be quite honest. But I do have other interests as well. I'm certainly very involved in my church. Raising 5 children takes a lot of time. I keep chickens. I love to grow vegetables. I'm part of a book club. Last book we read was the Odyssey.
Okay.
And I'm also working on Greek, so there's that too.
Fabulous. Are you focusing on Koine or Attic Greek or plan
Well,
both?
I have a small background in Attic Greek, but right now I'm more moving in the direction of Koine.
Okay.
So both
Yeah.
kind of.
Yeah. Eventually, it kind of morphs into both if you stay at it long enough. I think. Yeah. So that's wonderful. If reading your bio, I'm going to make some assumptions, but I'd love for you to correct me if I don't have those assumptions right. I find that a lot of teachers involved in the Christian classical renewal did not have a classical education themselves. It may have been Christian, it may even have been a fairly good education. But in my own case, somewhere along the line, after starting 2 brick and mortar schools, I discovered classical education, and it was it scratched that itch that we were trying to always solve with our students. And for me, it was a complete shift in thinking and pursuits. And so I'd love to hear about your experience. What was your education like growing up? How are you thinking about education these days?
Okay. Yeah, my education was kind of patchy. Some years I was homeschooled, some years I was in public school, some years I was at a little Christian school. I graduated from a Christian school, but after college, so in college I majored in history, which was my real passion at the time, and secondary education because I wanted to do something with history and thought I'd be a high school teacher. So it just sort of came to fruition. Although I mainly teach middle school now, I'm a full-time middle school teacher, but high school students online as well as middle. Anyway, where I was going with that is it wasn't in my education major at Gordon where I heard about classical education. I would say I really didn't understand what education was really about until after that, after I had the degree. And I started learning about some of the things going on in the classical Christian renewal. And especially when I attended a CiRCE conference in 2013, I think it was. And I soon thereafter got into the CiRCE apprenticeship, with Andrew Kern and Matt Bianco, and those guys really taught me what it means to teach, the form of teaching, and to understand better that the goal of teaching wasn't just to try to get kids to meet certain benchmarks, but was to cultivate virtue and really to nourish strong men and women.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in some ways your story is very similar to a lot of folks who, I've got my college degree and then, later on discover what education was all about, or what, what does that actually mean? And, I was just talking, I was on a show recently where they were asking me about classical education. And I was explaining that there was this point at which it kind of dawned on me that, the whole time while it dawned on me early on as a young adult that, my whole idea of education as a kid was I need to get a good job, right? I need to learn a
Yeah.
skill, and what is this all about? And then it dawned on me later on, you know, anybody can access all these skills, but it's the people who are shaping culture and, in a sense, kind of the governors of the world, those who are shaping culture and the way society works, who have pursued a kind of education, be it for ill or good. Those with a good education and toward a virtuous end were trying to steer it in the right direction. Others, may have taken a different approach. But I realized at that point in time, in a sort of roundabout way, before I heard it articulated well, that man, there's much more to education than just getting a job and being able to show up and do a good job. I need to know things about the world and how the world works, and about my own soul.
Mhm.
So, one of the things that you mentioned, was the CiRCE certified, master teacher, talk about in your bio, so the apprenticeship program. And I've known Andrew Kern for a lot of years and really admire the program. Can you talk a little bit about your experience there? How did that experience in the apprenticeship program prepare you to be a teacher?
Yeah. Well, I was already teaching, so that I think gave me the appreciation for what they were doing, because when you hear about something that you're not already practicing, it's hard to really realize how this applies. But
Yeah.
it was very, very clear immediately how it applied. Um, the focus on the students rather than the facts, the form of teaching that you want to show types or examples of, and many and diverse examples of whatever the concept is that you're trying to teach or the skill you're trying to teach, and then get the students to compare those examples so that they're actually contemplating what's in front of them in an active way. And then from there, they're kind of putting it together in their head. So it's a sort of inductive approach. um, Andrew Kern calls it the mimetic mode of teaching, and he would argue that all teaching, insofar as it teaches, is mimetic. But to know that and to go into it then intentionally, um, and with an idea of how it works, is just really powerful. So I'm really grateful for learning those things in the main apprenticeship, or rhetoric apprenticeship, I think they call it now, with CiRCE. But then I also, a few years later, so this was more recently, I did what CiRCE calls the tirocinum, which is just the Latin word for apprenticeship, basically. Um, and this is it's on a similar model, but this is their Latin training. And so, um, like classical education, I also never studied Latin in college, or very much as a child at all. I got into that when I was teaching, and partly on my own. I was just trying to work my way through wheelocks on my own and things like that. Um, but thanks to the CiRCE Institute, I found out about Lingua Latina per se illustrata, which is a textbook by Hans Orberg, who was a Danish gentleman. But it doesn't matter what country of the world you live in, because every word in this textbook is Latin. So your native language doesn't come into it. And it's a really fun and dynamic and powerful way to learn Latin. And I would say that other approaches have merit, but it sort of depends on what your goal is, right? So if your goal is to just really understand grammar, well, maybe you want to take a more systematic grammatical approach. However, if your goal is to actually read Latin, to read Latin text, you can get there the other way, but this is a more direct way, because you're practicing that from the beginning. And I learned a lot of Latin in the tirocinum with CiRCE, but the thing I'm most grateful for was learning how to teach Latin. The example set by Buck Haller in that program just gave me the exemplar to follow.
What would you call that approach? I've heard obviously the grammar approach. If you think of Wheelock's or Henley, and then there's the immersive approach, and then the colloquial approach. Where would this approach that you're teaching with Ortberg's Lingua Latina? What approach, maybe do we have a label for it, or?
Yeah. Most people call it the direct method.
Okay.
So it's not immersion, right? I mean, immersion would require moving to a Latin-speaking country,
Right,
which
right.
doesn't really exist. But it's not immersion, but it is largely inductive, and yet it follows a laid-out plan. It's very systematic. So the direct method is you're going to learn Latin in Latin. There is a lot of grammar in it. I mean, there's a ton of grammar in it, but the grammar is mainly taught in Latin as well. I will explain things now and then in English because it helps for the sake of clarity, given time constraints sometimes to explain something like that.
Sure.
But nonetheless, my explanation is just bringing clarity to something they're already discovering in many examples, um, and learning to use by following those examples.
So, can you talk a little bit about your courses specifically then? So what would be the difference between 2 and 3? What kind of prerequisite would there be to come into your classes, at the classes you teach here at Kepler?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, Normally, I would say the prerequisite is to take Latin 1. And I'm glad to say that there is a teacher at Kepler offering that, Felicity Tompkins, who also went through the CiRCE training. So that's probably the place to start for most people.
Okay.
Find out about her course. She uses much the same approach I do. And then from there, Latin 2, which I'm teaching, picks up on chapter 12. Now, if you have a student that's maybe middle of high school and they've been taking Latin for years, they might be able to jump into Latin 2, if they're a really strong Latin student. And I would say just have a good ability to learn things independently so that if there's any gaps, they can kind of figure it out. But I wouldn't want to take someone who is new to Latin without them having Latin 1.
Sure.
Then so Latin 2 is sort of the second third of the textbook, which basically means you're getting from beginner to intermediate level, like just getting to intermediate level at the end of Latin 2. And then Latin 3 is sort of I would say it's not all of what you should learn as an intermediate Latin student, but it is an intermediate Latin course, and you're getting to the end of Latin grammar. So by the end of Latin 3, you know all the morphology, all the inflection endings on nouns and verbs. You'll have learned all that by the end of Latin 3. There's still more vocabulary out there, but you'll have picked up a lot of that on the way, and you'll have had a lot of fun, and you'll have learned a lot of stories. In Latin 3, we read Theseus and the Minotaur, the story
Okay.
of Arion riding on the dolphin. There's a story about Julius Caesar being captured by pirates, and some new invented stories that the author made up. I'm telling you, Hans Orberg was a genius. I mean, a literary genius, that he could write such great children's literature in a foreign tongue and do so in a, like, not a dumbed down version of that tongue, but a constrained version that keeps to a limited vocabulary, and yet is so entertaining and beautiful.
That's fabulous. So I have to ask you, and this is a question I ask all of our classical language teachers, and for full transparency, I'm just kind of setting you up because I want to hear your answer to this. But so the question that's always asked: why learn Latin? Isn't this a dead language? What are the benefits? Can you get the same benefits out of reading a modern or learning a modern language? Why should we invest in Latin?
Well, I think my goal is to help young people make the journey ad fontes, right, to the source. If your goal is to read Roman and medieval texts someday in the original language, then this is the course for you. And why do that? Well, we talk about the great conversation, the conversation between authors over time. And really, if you're going back to the period between, let's say, the last of the Greek philosophers to honestly, about the middle of the modern period, um, most of the great books were being written in Latin. There were still some written in Greek, but especially the ones that have really formed Western culture. Wouldn't it be great to engage in the great conversation without an interpreter?
Yeah.
Without having someone to translate for you. And so that's why I think it's important, and it's a joy to do. And I will say, there are tons of benefits as a communicator in knowing Latin, because it's not just that you might know more English vocabulary because of all the derivatives we have. 60% of the English language is Latin words, or more than that, I believe. It's not just that you'll know more words, but the words themselves will come to life. For instance, the word precipitous, which is a really fancy word for steep. And, the word steep has so much punch when you hear it. I'd much rather hear the word steep in a poem than the word precipitous, because you almost have to think abstractly to remember what that even means. But if you've studied Latin and you know that prae means out in front and caput means head, then you realize that a precipitous fall would be pretty scary thing.
Yeah.
And I mean, knowing that in the abstract is fun, but if you actually have used Latin actively enough, you can get to the point where it's no longer an abstract, oh yeah, that's a cool fact, but it's like it hits you like it would to hear the word steep or the word head over heels, which is a great English phrase. So I think learning Latin brings English alive, if you learn Latin in a living and active way.
I love that answer. I mean, we could talk about the way that Latin is the root of science and theology and medicine. And I heard somebody ask one time, why does everything have to use those old Latin words? And not realizing that English came long after. And so when these concepts are discovered or fleshed out, obviously they're in a lot of times Latin terms. And
Yeah.
and of course we all know the old saying that trying to read poetry or literature in translations like kissing through a veil. So there's something to be gained. There's something beautiful to be gained in understanding, the worldview through reading in original sources. So I love. I'm just kind of reflecting on your answer there and love that. Well, as we near the end, we're not wrapping up quite yet, but as we're kind of nearing the end, can you tell us something a little interesting? I mean, you've given some interesting tidbits about the stories that Ortberg's produced for the students, but maybe a tidbit about your course in terms of like your personal approach or some nugget that people might be able to kind of look at or hold on to that you think's worth sharing.
Yeah, I'll say two more things about the course. One is, I think some people hear about this approach to Latin and think, oh, that's great. That sounds easier. I won't have to memorize as much. That's not a good reason to do it, because it's not easy. Okay, I just want to say that there's no shortcuts in learning a language. It takes time. It takes dedication. Um, I think it can be easier because a lot of the difficulty and struggle for students is that it isn't fun, and then that makes it harder. This usually is fun. I find it is often my students' favorite course. So it may make it easier in that way, but there's going to be a lot of work, and it's going to be especially taxing on the brain in class. You have to really listen carefully in order to pick up on everything. So just to correct that misunderstanding potentially. And then I would add another benefit that I love about teaching, particularly teaching this particular curriculum, is that the stories in the textbook bring to life Roman times, life in a Roman family, and sort of I would say the broader Mediterranean world of ancient times. And I also teach Christian studies here at the school that I work at full time. That's why I have a model temple behind me. I teach Christian studies, and when my students are reading parables that Christ teaches about sowing and reaping, and vineyards and shepherds, and all these things are so foreign to our daily life in the modern world. But in the stories that they'll read over the course of studying Latin, they're going to just have the life of a shepherd, the life of a farmer, the life of a household that includes slaves. Those things brought to life in a way that makes so many parables in the Bible make more sense. And not just the parables, but stories from the Old Testament or whatnot as well. Not to mention that the Roman army was there occupying Judea at the time of Christ. So many things from what you learn in Latin will apply in kind of in surprising ways, I think, just to being a Christian and trying to understand where our faith comes from.
I think that, I think that's a really good point, especially as you talked earlier about, the Advantes, getting back to the sources and primary sources. And in a sense, learning Latin takes you back to to that Hellenistic Roman, dominated culture where the Bible did come to life. And so you're really in many ways interacting with the culture that the Bible set in. So I think that's a marvelous point. Well, Jeremy, it's been a pleasure. I would have a number of other questions for you if we had more time to ask you about Latin. And, I find these conversations, really enlightening and encouraging. But as we've kind of come to the end of our time, I want our audience to know that all of Jeremy's courses are going to be listed here in the show notes, including Felicity Tompkins' course, just for continuity's sake. I'll list that course in there as well so that you can find those courses. So feel free to reach out to Jeremy, and you'll find him at kepler.education, and his contact form is on his profile, and feel free to reach out to him, ask him questions about the courses. And Jeremy, we're so glad to have you on board at Kepler this year, and we're excited about the jointure with CiRCE, and so looking forward to what you're going to bring to the table this fall. God bless you, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Scott.
Yeah, take care, all. God bless you.